frozen blood. She pressed her hands to her belly, as if trying to hold herself together by sheer will. Every breath came ragged, a plume of mist rising into the frigid air. Her boots were little more than rags now, soles worn thin, toes raw from ice. Yet she walked, step after halting step, through snow that wanted nothing more than to swallow her whole. The land gave no comfort, no mercy. Her body carried the marks of cruelty written across it, the kind only men leave when they do not see a woman as human. They had beaten her until her womb, once a quiet, sacred place, was turned into a battlefield for a child she had never chosen to bear. The pain seared deeper than any frostbite. The shame was a weight across her shoulders heavier than the snow. She had not asked for this life, this wound, this judgment whispered by every pair of eyes that had looked upon her in town. To them, she was no longer a woman, only a caution, a shadow of worth. She stumbled, knees buckling, palms sinking into the crust of ice. The cold bit into her skin like teeth. She looked behind her, half expecting to see them still, the men who had left her broken. But there was no one. The world itself had abandoned her to this silent graveyard of snow and pine. For a moment, she wished to lie there, to let the frost cover her body until she was no more than another mound on the hillside. But then a sound came, soft, small, her own breath rattling in her chest, reminding her she still lived. And though she felt hollowed out, though she believed herself ruined, life clung to her with the stubbornness of weeds breaking through stone. She pressed forward. A tree loomed, its roots twisted like the fingers of an old hand, forming a shallow hollow in the earth. Shelter of a kind, she crawled toward it, dragging herself through the snow, her fingernails caked with ice and soil. Within the hollow, the air was no warmer, but it was darker, a kind of hiding place. She curled against the roots, shivering, pulling her arms tight around her stomach. The pain there throbbed in time with her heartbeat spreading hot beneath her ribs. Blood stained the snow beneath her. Stark and vivid, a cruel flower blooming against the white. Her mind drifted backward. Faces blurred together. Men who laughed with their mouths full of whiskey, men who sneered at her silence, men who struck without hesitation. Among them one stood clearer, the first man. Once he had looked at her, as if she were his possession, nothing more. He had paraded her like a prize through town, hand at her back, a smile sharp as a blade. But behind closed doors, his pride soured into cruelty. When the child came, unwanted and unasked for, his face turned colder still. She had thought, foolishly, that carrying it might soften him, might make him see her as something more than flesh. Instead, it hardened his heart. She had become to him a vessel gone wrong, a burden, a flaw he could not forgive. He had struck her, cast her aside, let others do the same until she could no longer tell where the bruises ended and her skin began. Her lips cracked as she whispered into the hollow, a voice barely more than air. Not words of prayer, she had none left. Not pleas for mercy, mercy had abandoned her long ago. Only a sound, a small, broken reminder that she existed still. She listened to it vanish into the frozen earth, swallowed whole, as if even the ground wanted nothing to do with her. Yet somewhere within her chest, beneath the wreckage of bone and scar, an ember of defiance glowed. She had walked out, had left behind the men who thought to own her, had chosen the snow over the chains of their cruelty. That choice, however fragile, however desperate, belonged to her. And even as her body ached to surrender, her spirit clung to that single thread of will. The day dimmed into evening. Shadows lengthened across the snow, blue and violet, stretching like ink over parchment. The forest around her sighed, branches bending under the weight of ice. She thought of her mother once, long gone, who had told her that strength was not in loudness but in endurance. Her mother had lived hard and died harder, buried in soil that gave no answers. Perhaps she would join her soon. Her eyelids grew heavy, lashes crusted with frost. She let them fall, the world dimming to a haze of white and black. She felt herself sinking, her breath shallower, her body colder. Time slipped loose. In the distance, faint as a dream, she thought she heard the crunch of boots on snow. a rhythm too steady to be her imagination, too heavy to belong to the wind. Fear sparked first, a sharp pang that jolted her heart. Were they back? Had they come to drag her again, to finish what they had begun? She tried to lift her head, but her strength was gone. She lay still, blood pooling beneath her, the hollow turning into a cradle of death. The footsteps drew nearer. Snow compacted under weight, deliberate, unhurried. A shadow stretched across the hollow, vast and looming, blocking what little light remained. She forced her eyes open barely, and through the blur she saw him. A figure towering against the pale sky, broad-shouldered, chest bare to the winter, muscles carved by hardship. A beard tangled with frost, hair falling wild over his brow. A rifle slung across his back, but his hands empty, reaching not to strike, but to touch the air between them as if testing the fragility of the moment. Her breath caught. This was no man from town. No face she had known in her life of sorrow. This was something different, something fierce and strange. His eyes shadowed beneath his brow, held not hunger nor cruelty, but a quiet fire, a sorrow of his own that mirrored hers. Darkness tugged at her vision. Her body wanted to sink, to let go. But just before she slipped under, she felt the warmth of his hand, rough and calloused, press against her shoulder. It anchored her, pulled her back from the edge for one more moment. In that fleeting instant, as the world dissolved into black, she realized with a shock of fear and wonder that perhaps she had been found not by death, but by a promise she did not yet understand. The fire cracked softly in the cabin, its glow trembling across rough-hewn logs and casting long shadows up the walls. Outside, the storm still spoke in muffled howls, but in here there was only the fragile rhythm of breath. Hers shallow and uncertain, and his steady as the mountains themselves. He had carried her from the hollow beneath the roots, as though she were a wounded bird, each step deliberate, his arms cradling her against his chest while her blood left dark stains upon his skin. She weighed so little, yet the burden of what she carried, suffering carved into flesh and spirit, was heavier than any rifle or pelt he had ever borne. He set her down on a bed of furs near the fire, the warmth licking at her pale face. For a long moment he simply looked at her, as though unsure if she belonged here in his hidden world of solitude. The man had lived years without another soul beside him, choosing silence over the cruelty he had seen in towns, finding company only in the trees and the creatures that roamed them. Yet here she was, half dead and still clinging to life, as though the wilderness itself had delivered her into his keeping. He cleaned her wounds with snowmelt warmed in a tin pot, his hands surprisingly gentle for their size. Every scar on his knuckles, every callus on his palms told of labor and battles fought against beasts and men alike. But now those hands moved as though afraid they might break her further. She flinched once in her fever, a faint sound escaping her lips, and he paused, waiting, letting her breathe. He spoke no words. He had long ago learned that silence often healed better than talk. When at last she stilled, he stepped back, crouching by the fire. He studied her the way he studied the land, patiently reading signs others might miss. He saw the bruises blooming along her arms, the torn fabric near her belly, the way her body curled inward, guarding itself even in unconsciousness. He knew violence when he saw it. The world of men was rife with it, and though he had fled that world, its cruelty had found her all the same. Outside, a wolf howled, its cry rolling across the slopes like grief-made sound. The man lifted his head, listening, his gaze far away for a moment. He remembered another winter long ago, when he had carried a different body, colder, smaller, his wife, lifeless from fever, buried beneath a cairn of stones he still visited, though her voice had long faded from memory. That grief had driven him into exile, into these woods, away from the reach of human voices. Now fate had placed this woman before him, breathing but broken, and he felt the old ache stir. He wondered if the land was mocking him, reminding him that no matter how far he walked, he could not escape the weight of others. She stirred by the fire, a soft moan escaping her lips. Her eyes opened briefly, glazed with fever, and in them flickered a fear so raw it pierced even his seasoned heart. She saw him, his great frame, his scarred chest, his shadow filling the room, and for a moment she looked ready to flee, even in her weakness. He stayed still, hands open at his sides, not moving closer. He let her see that though he was strong enough to harm, he had no will to do so. Her gaze lingered on him, uncertain, then drifted shut again, exhaustion pulling her under. He exhaled slowly, relief mingled with sorrow. Trust was not something easily earned, and he knew from the marks on her body that hers had been shattered beyond measure. He would not demand it. He would wait, as one waits for spring after the longest winter. In the days that followed, his life shifted in ways he had not expected. He rose earlier, not just to hunt, but to check her breath, to make sure the fire had not died in the night. He cooked broths from venison and roots, spooning them slowly into her mouth when she was strong enough to swallow. He patched her clothing with strips of hide, careful not to intrude upon her modesty. He listened to her murmurs in sleep, half-formed words that spoke of terror and pleas, and though his chest ached, he did not rouse her. Let her battle her ghosts where they lived, while he kept the world outside from pressing in. On the third night, as snow pounded the roof, she woke fully for the first time. Her eyes flicked open, and she watched him where he sat by the hearth sharpening his knife. His movements were calm, measured, the scrape of stone against steel steady as a heartbeat. She spoke, her voice cracked and weak, asking not where she was, but why. Why had he not left her to the snow? He paused, the knife still in his hand. For a long moment he said nothing, staring into the blade as though the answer might be etched there. Then, in a voice low and rough with disuse, he replied that a creature broken still had the right to live. The world might be cruel, but he was not the world. He was only a man who had known loss enough to recognize it in another. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She turned her face toward the fire, her silence heavier than words. Yet something shifted between them in that moment. A thread, fragile and tentative, stretched across the gulf of solitude. She did not thank him, but she did not turn away when he offered water. That was enough. The next morning he stepped outside, snow crunching underfoot, the cold biting his skin like needles. The forest stretched endless and white, smoke rising from his chimney, the only sign of life. He thought of the town beyond the hills, of the whispers that traveled through its streets, of the man who had left her broken. He knew such cruelty did not end quietly. The past had a way of following, of demanding its due, and if they came for her, they would find her not alone, but with him standing before her. When he returned to the cabin, she was sitting upright for the first time, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the flames. She looked at him then, truly looked, as though measuring the shape of the man who had carried her from the brink. He held her gaze without speaking, letting her see the truth in his silence. He would not claim her, not pity her. He would simply remain, steady as the mountain, until she chose whether to stay or go. But as the wind howled against the walls and the night pressed close, he could not shake the feeling that their solitude would not last. Somewhere beyond the snowbound hills, danger waited, wearing the face of men who had already taken too much. And when it came, it would test not only her fragile spirit, but the vow he had not yet spoken aloud, the vow that already burned in his chest like a hidden flame. Days unfolded like slow-turning pages, each marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of firelight, the hiss of melting snow in a pot, the crack of wood splitting beneath his axe. She lingered in the quiet space between survival and surrender, body mending with an uneven grace, spirit hovering as though uncertain whether it deserved to return. In those first mornings, she woke to the sight of his back bent over the hearth, his frame vast yet careful, hands coaxing flame from embers. He never spoke first. He let her breathe, let her watch, let her decide if silence was safer than words. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. She asked for water, and he brought it, the cup steady in his hand, though her own trembled. She asked where she was, and he answered with only the truth, deep in the mountains, in a cabin no map would name. He did not say she was safe, though his presence made it so. He did not promise anything beyond the moment. She found that honesty easier to trust than any gentle lie. Her strength returned slowly. She could sit by the fire without swaying, walk a few paces across the floor before the wound in her belly ached. He left food within reach, venison stewed until tender, bread coarse but warm. When she faltered, he steadied her without grasping, his hand hovering just close enough to remind her she was not alone. Never once did he claim her body with his eyes, and in that restraint lay a kind of reverence she had never known. At dusk, when the world outside vanished into violet shadows, they sat across from each other, the flames between them painting their faces in shifting amber. She began to speak, not in long confessions but in fragments, like stones drawn one by one from a river. She told of the men who had used her, of the child forced upon her, of the violence that had left her hollow. The words fell flat in the air, brittle as ice, but he did not flinch. His silence was not empty. It was a vessel that held her grief without spilling it back upon her. In return, he offered small glimpses of himself, not as excuses but as mirrors. He spoke of the wife he had buried beneath stones, of the days he had spent wandering the wilderness, chasing silence until it became his only companion. He admitted that grief had made him hard, but solitude had taught him gentleness. His voice was deep, rough, but it carried no demand. Listening to him, she felt the strange comfort of standing at the edge of a canyon and hearing her own pain echo back. Snowstorms bound them together in ways neither could deny. When the wind shrieked through the trees and the roof groaned under weight, they huddled close to the fire, wrapped in blankets, the air thick with the scent of smoke and pine sap. Once, when the cold crept too sharp into her bones, he draped a fur over her shoulders, his hand lingering for a heartbeat before pulling away. She caught the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as though he, too, was afraid of breaking something fragile. The warmth stayed with her longer than the pelt itself. She found herself noticing the details of him. The scar across his collarbone, pale against his skin, telling of some forgotten battle. The way he mended a trap with patience, weaving wire as though it were thread. The gentleness with which he handled a wounded hare, setting it free after tending its leg. He was not the brute his size suggested, nor the beast the town gossips might have painted him. He was something harder to name, strength tempered by restraint, solitude softened by sorrow. One evening, when the storm had calmed and the sky outside blushed with the pale light of a hidden moon, he showed her how to cut wood. She gripped the axe with trembling hands, her body unsteady. He stood behind her, not touching, only guiding with quiet words. Her first swing clattered weak, the blade glancing off. She cursed under her breath, cheeks burning, shame rising like bile. But he only nodded, as though failure was a necessary step. With time, the wood split, sharp and clean, and she felt a flicker of pride in her chest. He smiled then, faint but real, and it startled her more than any words could have. As days bled into nights, trust grew like shoots beneath thawing snow. She began to move freely in the cabin, tending the fire, brushing the floor, reclaiming small fragments of usefulness. He never directed her, never expected, but allowed her to take space in his world until it felt, strangely, like their world. The silence between them changed too. It no longer pressed down with weight, but stretched open like sky, spacious and gentle. Yet shadows lingered. One night, curled near the fire, she confessed through tears that she feared she was ruined, that no man could see her as whole again, not after what had been done. Her hands clutched at her belly as though the wound still bled. He leaned forward, his voice low, steady, telling her that worth was not measured in what had been taken, but in what she still carried inside. She was not broken, she was surviving, and survival itself was defiance. His words struck deeper than comfort. They sounded like a vow, though he did not name it so. The air between them shifted after that, charged yet unspoken. She found herself watching him with new eyes, not as a savior, but as a man carved from solitude, whose strength was offered not to own her, but to shield her. He, in turn, seemed to hold himself in check, as though aware of a fragile thread pulling them closer, unwilling to snap it too soon. Their bond deepened not in sudden passion, but in the slow bloom of recognition. two wounded souls finding reflection in one another. Still, beneath it all, fear coiled tight. She knew the world beyond the snow had not forgotten her. The man she had fled, and the whispers that clung to her name, would not vanish like frost under sun. And though the cabin felt safe, she sensed the storm outside was not only of weather. Late one night, when the fire had burned to embers and the cabin was thick with shadows, she woke to the sound of his footsteps. He stood by the window, staring out into the white silence. His hand rested on the rifle propped by the door. His shoulders were tense, his breath slow but heavy, as if listening for something only he could hear. She lay still, heart quickening, realizing that whatever waited beyond those trees might soon test not only the fragile peace between them but the unspoken promise he had begun to weave around her life. The thaw came slow, first as rivulets whispering beneath the snowdrifts, then as dark patches of earth widening along the cabin's walls. The air softened, carrying the smell of damp pine and distant rivers breaking free of ice. She sat by the doorway, shawl draped around her shoulders, watching the world loosen its grip from winter's hand. For weeks she had known only the rhythm of firelight and silence, his presence moving steady within that narrow world. Now the forest itself seemed to call her outward, though with its promise came a shiver of unease. Beyond these trees lay the eyes of others, and she did not know if she was ready to be seen. The mountain man split wood nearby, each swing of the axe echoing through the clearing. His muscles moved with ease, yet his eyes flicked often toward the tree line, scanning shadows as though expecting them to stir. She noticed it more each day, the way his hand lingered on the rifle by the door, the way he paused when the wind carried sound from beyond the ridge. He did not speak of it, but she understood. The world had not forgotten her. Cruelty never released its hold so easily. One afternoon, a knock came, not sharp but hesitant. She froze, breath caught in her chest. Few dared tread this far into the mountains, and fewer still with kindness in mind. He opened the door to find a boy no older than 12, cheeks red from the climb, arms burdened with a bundle of firewood. The child stammered, explaining that his uncle, a trapper from a nearby hollow, had sent him. The man nodded, offering no questions. She watched from the hearth, heart trembling, until the boy's eyes flicked toward her, wide with recognition. Word had spread. That evening, as the sun bled orange over the peaks, he spoke at last. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the weight in it. The town knew she lived. Whispers traveled faster than rivers in thaw, and her presence here would not remain hidden long. She felt her stomach twist, shame rising like bile. They would say she had thrown herself into the arms of a savage, that she carried ruin wherever she went. She turned away, clutching her shawl tighter, wishing she could shrink into the cracks of the floorboards. In the days that followed, memories of the town returned sharper than ever. Women turning their faces when she passed. Men smirking, their eyes crawling over her as if she were nothing but a tale to be told in taverns. She had thought leaving would free her of their judgment, yet it pressed closer now, invisible but suffocating. At night, she wept quietly, believing herself cursed to be marked forever. He did not try to hush her. He sat nearby, head bowed, his silence steady as a hand upon her shoulder without touch. The preacher came next, old and bent, his hoarse breathing clouds into the still cold air. He brought no condemnation, only a sack of flour and words spoken gently by the fire. He told her the town was divided, some still bound by cruelty, but others whispering a different story of a woman who had endured what few could survive. His presence eased her for a moment, yet the fear lingered, a shadow beneath his kindness. He left with a blessing, and she felt as though he carried a piece of her shame away with him, though never enough to empty her heart. One evening, she confessed her deepest wound. Sitting by the fire, her hands clutching the fabric over her belly, she whispered that she could never bear a child again. The violence had taken that from her, and with it she believed her worth as a woman. The words spilled like stones, heavy and jagged, and when she finished she bowed her head, unable to meet his gaze. For a long moment he said nothing, then he knelt before her, his frame vast, but his voice soft as falling ash. He told her she was not measured by what she could give, nor by what had been taken. She was enough as she was, breathing, surviving, enduring. His eyes did not waver, and she felt the truth of it press into her like warmth after frost. The days grew longer, the snow retreating into shadows. She found herself walking further from the cabin, her legs growing stronger with each step. The boy returned now and then, bringing wood or fish, his presence shy but steady. She saw in his eyes not judgment, but the curiosity of one who sensed a secret worth guarding. Once he asked if she would come down to the river when the thaw was complete, and though she said nothing, the question lingered like an unopened door. Still, unease gnawed at her. She dreamed often of the first man, his voice like a whip, his fists striking without warning. She feared he would come for her, that the forest would one day split with the sound of hooves and guns. Each night she checked the window, listening for the crunch of boots on thawing ground. And each night she saw him, the mountain man standing watch, rifle in hand, as though he could hold the darkness at bay by sheer will. The bond between them deepened not in sudden fire, but in quiet persistence. She found herself laughing once, startled by the rare sound, when he fumbled a pot of stew and cursed softly under his breath. The sound hung in the cabin like birdsong, fragile yet alive. He looked at her then, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and in that moment she felt something bloom within her, tentative and trembling but real. Yet the world pressed closer. A trader passing through carried news. The first man had been asking questions, his pride stung by whispers of her survival. He would not rest, the trader said, until he proved himself master again. The words chilled her blood. She sat stiff by the fire that night, unable to eat, her hands trembling against the bowl. He noticed, of course, and though he said little, his hand tightened around the rifle until his knuckles whitened. She lay awake long after the fire had dimmed, staring at the ceiling. Fear coursed through her veins, but alongside it something else stirred, a strange, defiant strength. She was not the same woman who had crawled into the hollow of a tree, waiting for death. She had found shelter here, and perhaps something more. The thought frightened her almost as much as the danger beyond the ridge. As dawn broke pale over the mountains, she turned on her pallet and saw him still awake, seated by the window, his silhouette framed in the first light. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, but his presence filled the room with unspoken promise. In that moment she knew. The world was coming, carrying cruelty in its hands, and soon it would reach their door. And when it did, she would no longer face it alone. Spring crept across the mountains like a careful hand, peeling away the last of winter's hold. Snow shrank into rivulets that glittered in the sun, rivers swelled with restless voices, and the pines shed their icy burdens to breathe again. In the clearing, the cabin stood as it had through countless storms, smoke curling skyward in steady lines, a small defiance against the vastness of the world. Inside, warmth lingered not only in the hearth but in the presence of two souls who had weathered the frost together. She moved with more certainty now, her steps no longer faltering. The shawl, that once clung like a shield, had slipped often from her shoulders, forgotten as she carried water, brushed the floor, or knelt to tend the embers. Those scars still marked her body. She no longer shrank from her own reflection in the basin. She had begun to see herself not as broken, but as breathing proof that pain could be endured without erasing the person beneath. He watched her without intrusion, his silence steady, but no longer distant. The solitude that had once been his refuge was reshaped by her presence, and he found no longing for the emptiness he had once called peace. She brought with her a stillness of a different kind, not absence, but the quiet of trust, the hush of wounds slowly mending. Yet beneath his calm, he carried an awareness as sharp as the edge of his knife. The world beyond their cabin had not forgotten, and danger pressed closer with each passing day. It came first as hoofbeats on thawing ground. She heard them before he did, sitting by the window, with her mending in her lap, the steady rhythm of horses breaking the silence of the forest. Fear shot through her veins, cold and familiar. She rose, fabric slipping from her hands, and when he entered the room, she needed no words. His rifle was in his grip before the echo of hooves had faded. Through the trees they came, 3 men, their figures dark against the pale green of spring, their faces twisted by the arrogance of those who believe cruelty is their right. At their front rode the first man, his mouth curved in a smile that was more wound than expression. He called her name into the clearing, voice sharp, claiming her as though nothing had changed. She flinched at the sound, old memories clawing their way to the surface, but then her gaze shifted to the mountain man at her side, broad frame steady as stone. He stepped forward, planting himself between her and the riders. His voice, when it came, was low, but carried like thunder across the clearing. "She is not yours." His words struck heavier than any bullet. The men sneered, mocking his solitude, calling him beast, hermit, madman. But she saw no madness in him, only the clarity of a vow long born. The first man dismounted, boots sinking into damp earth. He spat, words dripping with venom, speaking of debts unpaid, of a woman ruined and meant to be discarded. She felt the sting of shame at his voice, but it burned away faster than before. The mountain man's presence beside her was shield enough, his silence more powerful than any insult flung across the space between. Tension hung like a bowstring drawn too tight. The rifle in his hands gleamed in the pale light, but he had not raised it. His eyes, steady and unflinching, told the men that violence would not come unless they forced it. For a moment, she thought the standoff would break into bloodshed, but something in his stance, unyielding, immovable as the peak behind them, gave even the cruelest pause. The first man cursed, spit dark into the soil, and though his pride writhed, he turned at last, mounting again. Their retreat was not grace, but spite, promises of return hanging in the air like smoke. When the hoofbeats faded, she collapsed onto the step, her chest heaving. He set the rifle aside and knelt before her, hands bracing hers. She expected him to tell her she was safe, but he did not. Instead, he told her that safety was not promised, not in this world, not in these times. What he did promise was his place between her and the cruelty that sought her. He swore, with the quiet weight of stone, that she and the life taken from her would not vanish into silence. They would live, through her breath, through his vow, through the defiance of their survival. Her tears came then, not of weakness but release. She pressed her forehead to his, and in the stillness she felt the fire that bound them, no wild blaze of passion, but the enduring flame of shelter, steady and eternal. The child she had never chosen, the wound that had been scarred, the pain carved into her body, all of it would be remembered, not as ruin, but as testament. As the river roared in the valley below and the mountain stood eternal above, she realized her life had shifted. She was no longer a woman wandering toward death in the snow. She was a survivor standing beside a man who had chosen not to possess her, but to protect her, not to silence her, but to listen. Their story was not yet done, for the world would test them again. But within that cabin, in the hush between storms, a fire had been lit that no cruelty could extinguish, and as she leaned into his strength, hearing the faint rhythm of his heartbeat against her ear, she knew the next battle was not only against the men beyond the trees, but against the lie she had carried too long, that she was broken beyond repair. For in his vow, in the steadiness of his arms, she felt the first glimmer of a truth she had never dared believe. She was alive, she was seen, and she was more than enough.